Today, I wanted to talk about what I'm going to call taming the mind, handling distractions, and training concentration. Now, in saying that, I want to acknowledge that mindfulness is more than paying attention or concentrating, although paying attention and concentrating certainly support our mindfulness practice. So I mentioned in the past that attention is the process that really powers up our caring about something or someone, ourselves, others, our community. So in order to tame, here's a few steps. One is determine if your attention is being influenced by intention and your core values or unconscious habits. Now, how do we determine that? Well, what came to my mind are the wise words of the American philosopher Yogi Berra, who once said, "You can see a lot by looking." So the process of observation, and I would say with rigorous honesty, can help us determine if our attention is being once again hijacked by our smartphone or by surfing the internet, or our attention is really where we want it to be and most productively for us to be. So we have to be really honest. And, we go back and forth. And it's really challenging. I want to acknowledge this for myself and for all of you. It is challenging to be unaffected by the conditioned patterns that are influenced by our early family relationships, our current relationships, and also the culture we live in, which is bombarding our brain, and the eyes are part of the brain, bombarding our brains with all kinds of messages that reflect certain values that maybe we don't even ascribe to. I love this metaphor from the movie, if you've seen it, Unplugging from the Matrix. It's a good metaphor for mindfulness practice. Because when we know our mind and when we can intentionally influence where we want to place our mind, then we can sort of unplug from the matrix. And by matrix, in this context, I mean, not be so influenced by all that distractible energy in our world, because we notice how we're getting pulled to it. And so another way is to notice, this is part of it, noticing where your attention is captured in habitual ways. This is the other side of unplugging. Often it's, as I mentioned, computer and emails, although it could be immersion into binging on the news, or even being negative. There's a lot of negativity in our world and in the human mind, and if we're mindful of it, then we can catch it and begin to influence how we speak silently to ourselves and overtly to other people. We can also notice what nutriments we are taking in. Nutriments has to do with the nourishment received by your mind, which can be harmful or healthy. I'm not talking about food, although it could be. It could be electronic energy or the news or the thoughts. And lastly, we want to turn our attention. When we're mindful, we can turn our attention toward what really, truly matters. Returning from distraction, whether meditating or in everyday life, returning with a certain amount of equanimity, emotional balance. And then the third major point here is that we want to train our attention and concentration. Of course, we can do that, as I think we all know, by meditating. But within meditation, there are a couple skills that we can practice, especially when our minds seem to be hyper distractible. For example, we can note the breath by silently saying in, out, or rising, falling when we're breathing. If you're paying attention to the breath at the nostrils, often it's useful to silently note in, out. If you're paying attention to the breath at the level of the belly, it might be easier to notice or note the rising or falling of the belly, of the diaphragm. In my own practice, I find that when I'm particularly distracted, I go back to silently noting, and then I let the noting go as soon as possible. I don't want to get dependent on it, although there's nothing wrong with using that for months or years if that supports you in staying present. But often the progression is using it when you are in need, and then letting go of that noting when you feel somewhat stable in your meditation. And then in meditation culture, this is an old, I believe, Sanskrit term. The old term is using a gatha, G-A-T-H-A. I don't want to get too technical, but for our purposes, what that word means is a mindfulness verse, a verse such as breathing in, mind is calm. Breathing out, body is relaxed. Like a mantra. We were talking about mantras the other week. Like a mantra. You can make up the mantra, or you can use something like breathing in, mind is calm, breathing out, body is relaxed, or in, calm, out, relaxed, or anything that calls to you. You can even in everyday life, which is the focus here, you can reinforce your mindfulness around mundane matters. I am brushing my teeth, I am washing my hands, to bring some life and energy and presence to what you're doing. And I like to think that that can break the trance. In everyday life, what we're often doing is connecting to sensory experience. For washing your hands, you're feeling maybe the soap, you're feeling the friction between your hands. And once you make that sensory contact, then you can drop the notation of saying, I am washing my hands. Another way we can reinforce focus is to name your distractions. Sounds like a quiz show. Name that distraction. So here are some of the basic categories of distraction. The big one is thinking, but it also might be planning, judging, remembering, and imagining. Those are some of the sweeping categories of distractions. Notice I framed them all with one word because otherwise we get too analytic about it and we get swept away into the analysis. We can also focus on body sensations, as I mentioned. And last week I mentioned that I believe it was last week, I mentioned there's 6 channels of experience, Beyond thinking, there's hearing, seeing, smelling, touching, and tasting. You can purposefully tune into one of those channels to basically unplug from the thought stream and plug consciously into the sensory stream, So for me, in general, the balance point is when I want to balance the mental energy, not to say the mental energy is a bad thing, but if I find it somewhat excessive, switch to the body energy. the sensations of the body, as well as the sensory experience or the perceptual experience of the body, as I mentioned. And then just a couple other points here. We'll open it up to comments and discussion, and we'll have time for a long meditation. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, time in nature, but with a focus on the external sensory experience. It really opens up your time in nature when you're looking, you're really seeing, not just looking, you're seeing, you're smelling. Recently, I don't feel like I have a refined olfactory sense, my sense of smell, but because I'm trying to follow my own teachings and the teachings of others, I'm finding I'm developing some nuanced sense of smell when I'm out there in the forest, and it feels good. Also, tune up our attention and brains, learn a new skill. Now, this involves mindfulness, but it's not about, a formal meditation. Some new skills that come to my mind are learning a foreign language, which I'm in the middle of doing right now. I'm learning slowly the Portuguese language, which is one of the most nuanced languages I've ever encountered. Not as difficult as Chinese, which I can only say about 2 or 3 words in Chinese, but it is a very nuanced language, and it requires a lot of attention and concentration and mindfulness. Learning a musical instrument. I think maybe Jim mentioned this last week. This is another way to activate the mind of attention and concentration and mindfulness. Recently, because I do play a few different instruments, and one of the instruments I play is percussion. And I noticed that to really be there in the groove, as a percussion player might say, you have to really pay attention and get out of the way of thinking about it, and really feeling it. Also, dancing, Tai Chi, yoga, anything that is a body-based skill that requires you to pay attention can train mindfulness and concentration. I think one of the reasons why I really like Tai Chi is because it's very complex. And if I don't pay close attention when I'm standing on one leg, I wobble and or topple over. So it's sort of like a task that requires me to be present. And then lastly, these are 2 very basic things that sometimes get neglected in our busy culture. One is get a good night's sleep. One of the most basic things you can do for the health of your brain and body is to get a good night's sleep. I can go on and on about that. Maybe I'll have a module on mindfulness and sleep some week. And then lastly, engage in regular exercise. Lately, the rule of thumb I've been using is at least 40 minutes of walking per day. It used to be maybe we say, 20 or 30. Now, all the way up to 60 to 90 minutes a day. Walking is a great moderate exercise, and it is good not just for the body, but also for the brain. And that can help us to be more in tune, to be more attentive, to be more in the present moment. I was recently teaching a physical balance workshop, and what I concluded is that, walking is a wonderful way to cultivate physical balance, especially if you slow your walking down and you walk sometimes on uneven ground, because you have to pay attention so that you don't stumble. So all of this comes together. So that's my wrap, if you will, for today.